The morning Opal Hayes turned down her fourth marriage proposal in as many months. She did it while pulling weeds from a garden that wasn't even hers, and she didn't feel a single regret about it. The town of Cassidy Creek, Texas, sat in the long shadow of the Davis Mountains, a place where the wind blew hot and dry in the summer and cold enough to split your skin in winter. It was 1879, and the land still had that raw, untamed quality that made some people feel small and others feel alive. Opal Hayes fell firmly into the second category. She had come to Cassidy Creek 3 years ago with her father, a wandering schoolteacher named Gerald Hayes, who had believed with his whole heart that every frontier town deserved educated children, and who had died of fever 6 months after their arrival, leaving Opal with a half-built house on the east side of town, a small inheritance of books, and the singular reputation of being the most capable and most stubborn woman west of San Antonio. She was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a worn straw hat when she worked, and green eyes that had a habit of seeing straight through whatever polite nonsense people offered her. She was not what most men called beautiful in the conventional sense, not the soft and powdered kind of beauty that sat well in a parlor. She was the kind of beautiful that came from competence and conviction, from knowing exactly who she was and refusing to pretend otherwise. The man who had just asked her to marry him was Harlan Beckett, owner of the largest dry goods store in Cassidy Creek, and a man who genuinely believed he was doing her a favor. He was 41 years old, wore a gold watch chain he liked to loop between his fingers when he talked, and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Opal," he had said, standing at the edge of the vegetable garden she was tending behind the widow Marlowe's property, "I am offering you a fine house, a warm kitchen, and a life without hardship. Any sensible woman would consider that a blessing." Opal had not looked up from the soil. "I am sure she would, Harlan, but I am not any sensible woman." "You are throwing away comfort," he said, his voice tightening. "I am declining your proposal," she corrected pleasantly. "There is a difference." He had left with his dignity bruised but his pride still intact, which was more than she owed him. The widow Marlowe, a small bird-like woman of 60 who watched everything from her rocking chair on the back porch, had cackled with genuine delight. "That is 4, the widow said, holding up 4 thin fingers. "I am aware of the count," Opal said. "People are going to call you difficult. People already call me difficult. They also call you foolish, turning down men with money and property." Opal sat back on her heels and pulled off one of her work gloves, studying the calloused palm beneath. "They can say what they like. I would rather earn my own way than be grateful to a man for the roof over my head. I have watched women lose themselves inside comfortable marriages. I have watched them become furniture. I will not be furniture." The widow Marlowe rocked twice before answering. "No," she said at last, "I do not suppose you will." What Opal did not say, because she was not in the habit of confessing things she could not yet fully name, was that it was not just comfort she was refusing. She was refusing a particular kind of transaction that was dressed up as love. She was refusing the bargain where a man offered safety and expected in return her gratitude, her compliance, and the quiet surrender of everything she was. The men who had proposed to her had offered houses and security and standing in the community. Not one of them had offered her himself, honestly and completely, without an inventory of what he expected to receive. She was not holding out for some fanciful notion of romance. She was holding out for something real. She just did not know yet that real was riding into Cassidy Creek on a dusty roan horse 3 days later, carrying a battered leather satchel, a change of clothes, and the particular kind of silence that belongs to a man who has spent long years learning when to speak and when to simply be present. His name was Elijah Rhodes, and he arrived on a Thursday. Cassidy Creek was not the kind of town that ignored a stranger, especially one who rode in alone on a horse that looked like it had been places. The roan was a good animal, well tended despite the dust on both of them, and the man in the saddle sat easy, which told you something about him right away. He had broad shoulders and a lean build, dark hair curling slightly at his temples from the heat, and a face that was open and weathered in equal measure. He was 29 years old, though the particular quality of stillness about him made him seem both younger and older than that depending on how you caught him. He tied his horse at the post outside the sheriff's office and walked inside without hesitation, which was the first thing that made Deputy Calhoun sit up a little straighter. "Help you?" the deputy said. "Looking for work," Elijah said. "Heard there was need of a man who knows horses. Heard there might be some trouble with cattle moving through from the south. Heard the sheriff here was looking for a capable hand." The deputy studied him. "You a lawman?" "I was, not anymore." "What are you now?" Elijah thought about that for a moment in the way of a man who took questions seriously. "Honest," he said, "and good with my hands. That tends to cover most of what needs covering." Sheriff Amos Whitfield, a broad, gray-mustached man who had run Cassidy Creek for 12 years with steady competence and very little drama, was in the back room when he heard that exchange. He came out, looked Elijah over, and made the kind of quick assessment that experienced lawmen make. "Elijah Rhodes," Elijah said, extending his hand. "I know that name," the sheriff said, shaking it. "You rode with the Rangers out of Fort Davis. Then you had your own trouble." "I did," Elijah said. He did not offer more, and the sheriff did not push, which told you something about both of them. "The trouble with cattle I can explain," the sheriff said. "There's a rancher named Duval who has been running his herd through the eastern corridor without giving proper notice or compensation to the small farms along that route. He has got enough money to make arguing with him expensive. I need someone to ride the corridor, keep records, and make sure those farmers are not run over. It is not glamorous work. It pays $35 a month, and you can sleep in the spare room above the livery." "That is honest work," Elijah said. "It is. I will take it." He was at the livery stable arranging his things when Opal Hayes came in later that afternoon to check on the widow Marlowe's old mare, which had developed a slight swelling in her left foreleg. Opal did not notice the man at first because she went straight to the mare's stall, set down her basket, and began running her hands down the horse's leg with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to be thorough. "She has been favoring it for 2 days," Opal said, mostly to herself, pressing carefully along the tendon. "Soft tissue strain," said a voice from the next stall over. "Not serious if she rests it. There is plantain growing along the creek bed, east side. Poultice of plantain leaves and willow bark wrapped overnight will bring the swelling down." Opal looked up. The man was leaning against the partition of the neighboring stall, arms folded, watching the mare with genuine interest rather than looking at her, which she noticed. He had a calm about him that was not indifference but rather the opposite, the kind of calm that comes from paying close attention. "You know horses," she said. "I know a few things," he said. He extended his hand across the partition. "Elijah Rhodes just arrived." She shook it without ceremony. "Opal Hayes." Something in his expression shifted just slightly, as if her name had registered somewhere meaningful and then smoothed again into that same easy attention. "You tend animals regularly." "I tend whatever needs tending," she said. "There is no veterinarian within 40 miles. Someone has to know the basics." "That is useful," he said, and it was not the kind of compliment that asked for anything back. It was just an observation offered without fanfare, and she found herself unexpectedly pleased by it. "The widow Marlowe owns this mare," she said, turning back to the horse. "She is fond of her. I will get the plantain tomorrow morning." "Creek bed runs past the gantry farm on the east road," he said. "I am riding that way at first light. I could cut some for you." "You do not know me well enough to cut herbs on my behalf," she said. "True," he agreed. "But I know the mare, and she does not deserve to limp when there is a remedy close by." Opal looked at him then properly, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. He met her gaze without flinching, and without that particular masculine discomfort she often provoked when she looked at people directly. He just looked back, steady and unhurried. "All right," she said. "I will be at the East Road at sunrise." He nodded once, returned to whatever he had been doing in the neighboring stall, and that was the end of it for that day. But she thought about those eyes on the walk home, thought about the way he had described the remedy without condescension, the way he had given it as information and not as performance. She thought about the fact that he had looked at the horse and not at her, which somehow made her more interested in him than any amount of deliberate attention would have. She put those thoughts away carefully, in the part of her mind she reserved for things that needed more considering, and went home to make supper. The plant and run at sunrise turned into something she had not expected. He was waiting at the East Road junction precisely when he said he would be, already holding a handful of freshly cut plantain, his boots dark with creek mud. He handed it to her without ceremony, and then stood with his hands in his pockets looking out at the low hills to the east as if she were not there, as if being in her company required nothing particular from him. Most men, when they were alone with her, became either too eager or too stiff. Elijah Rhodes was neither. He was simply present, which she found profoundly disarming. "You rode for the Rangers," she said, "because in a town this size information traveled. For 6 years," he said. And then he was quiet for a moment. "There was a man I was asked to bring in, a homesteader who had shot a cattle baron's overseer. The overseer had been destroying the man's crops deliberately for months at the orders of the baron who wanted the land. The homesteader had a family, 3 children. He did what men do when they have run out of legal options and their children are going hungry." He paused. "My captain wanted him hanged. I did not agree with that." "What did you do?" "I resigned," he said simply. "And I told the homesteader he had 2 days before someone less particular than me would come for him. He took his family and left the territory." Opal held the plantain loosely in her hands and looked at him. "That cost you." "It did. You do not seem sorry for it." "I am not." She started walking back toward the town proper, and he fell into step beside her, natural as if they had been walking together for years. The morning was cool still, the light coming over the mountains in long golden sheets, and the world had that particular clarity it only had in the early hours before the heat set in. "Most men would not tell that story as a straightforward fact," she said. "Most men would either make themselves the hero or be too ashamed to mention it at all." "It is just what happened," he said. "Most things are more complicated than people tell them." "Most things are simpler than people make them," he said. "They just have complicated consequences." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, the kind that came before she had a chance to consider whether it was appropriate. He glanced at her sideways with just the edge of a smile, as if her laughter was a thing he found genuinely pleasant and not something he was trying to earn. They parted at the junction of Main Street, and she went one way and he went another, and she caught herself watching the direction he had gone for a moment longer than made any particular sense. The widow Marlowe's mare recovered beautifully. Within 3 days the swelling was gone and the old horse was walking steady again, and the widow herself was so pleased that she baked a pie and told Opal to take half of it to the new man at the livery, which was the most transparent act of matchmaking Opal had encountered in recent memory. "He told me about the poultice," Opal said flatly. "Yes, and you made it," the widow said. "2 people, 1 result. Take him the pie, Opal." She took him the pie because it would have been rude not to, and also because she wanted to, which she admitted to herself with a directness she valued even when it was inconvenient. She found him in the corral behind the livery working with a young horse that had been giving the stable keeper trouble. He was not forcing the animal. He was standing at the edge of the corral, not pursuing the horse but not retreating either, just breathing, patient as stone, letting the horse come to his own conclusions. It was the most effective and most gentle method of gentling a horse, and it was not common knowledge, and she stood at the fence for several minutes watching before he noticed her. "The widow says thank you," she said, holding up the wrapped pie. He crossed the corral and took it from her over the fence post, and the young horse came and nosed at him from behind, which was in itself a small miracle after 3 weeks of the animal refusing to be touched. "That horse was going to be sold to the rendering works by next Friday," she said, watching. "He was scared," Elijah said. "Not mean, there is a difference." You think most mean things are really just scared things. He considered it. Most, not all. There is real cruelty in the world. But a lot of what looks like cruelty up close is actually just terror wearing a bad face. She leaned on the fence rail and he stood on the other side of it, the horse now pressing its forehead against his shoulder with something that looked very much like trust, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular. About the mountains to the west, about the difference between the land here and the land further north, about books she had read, and whether he had read them, which he had, more than she expected, in the long, lonely stretches between work. He had read Dickens, and he had read Emerson, and he had read whatever he could get his hands on with the particular hunger of a man whose education had been interrupted by circumstance, but whose mind had never stopped working. When she finally left, walking back through the cooling evening, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not the slightly suffocating warmth of being pursued, but something lighter and more honest. She felt seen. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself he was a man who had just arrived and she did not know him, and she was not the kind of woman who fell quickly into things. All of these things were true. None of them made any difference to the fact that she thought about the conversation until she fell asleep. Over the weeks that followed, Elijah settled into Cassidy Creek the way good people settle into places, gradually and without fuss, becoming part of the texture of the town without demanding attention. He rode the eastern corridor as the sheriff had hired him to do, keeping careful records of every time Duval's cattle were moved through without proper notice, noting the damage to fencing and crops, speaking respectfully to the farmers who were understandably furious and frightened. He had a quality she had not seen often in men. He listened. Not the way men listened when they were waiting for a pause in which to speak, but actually listened, taking in what was said and sitting with it before responding. The small farmers along the corridor, men who had been ignored and talked over by men with more money and more lawyers, noticed this immediately. By the end of his second week, he had the trust of every homesteader on the route, which was more than the sheriff had managed in 12 months of trying. Opal crossed his path regularly, because Cassidy Creek was not a large town, and also because she did not avoid it. She taught 3 days a week at the schoolhouse her father had built, spending the other days managing her small house, helping the widow Marlowe, and doing the various kinds of practical work that kept her from depending on anyone else's charity. She was in the habit of bringing books to the schoolhouse from her father's collection, and one afternoon Elijah happened to be passing when she was struggling with a box of them, 3 stacks tied together and more than she could comfortably carry. He did not ask. He simply fell into step beside her and took half the box without preamble. "I could have managed," she said. "You could," he agreed, "but now you do not have to." It was such a small thing. It was such a completely different thing from every other man who had offered to help her, because he did not make it about her inability or his strength. He just helped, and then they walked together, and he asked her what she was teaching that week. She told him about the history she was covering, about the settlement of Texas, which was complicated history full of violence and injustice toward the Comanche and the Apache peoples who had been pushed from lands that had been theirs for centuries. History she taught honestly rather than as the triumphant march most school books presented it as. He listened to that with real attention. "Not many teachers would go that route," he said. "My father taught me that an honest accounting of history serves children better than a flattering one," she said. "These children will grow up on this land. They ought to know what it cost and who paid. Your father sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I knew," she said, simply and without excessive sentiment, "the way you speak about grief that has had time to become part of you without breaking you." They reached the schoolhouse and he set down his half of the books, and she looked at him in the afternoon light and thought very clearly, without drama or confusion, that she was in danger of caring about this man in a way that would not be reversed. That night, Harlan Beckett appeared at her door again. He was not exactly apologetic, but he was subdued in a way that suggested he had been thinking. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and said he hoped there were no hard feelings and that his offer still stood, whenever she was ready to think sensibly about her situation. "My situation is fine, Harlan," she said. "You are living alone on a schoolteacher's salary teaching 3 days a week," he said. "That is not sustainable. It has been sustainable for 3 years. Opal," he shifted his weight, "people are talking about you and that new man." She went very still. "Are they?" "They are saying you have been seen with him several times. A woman in your position should be careful about appearances." "A woman in my position," she repeated, with a quietness that was more dangerous than shouting. He at least had the sense to take a half step back. "I only mean that—" "Good night, Harlan," she said, and closed the door with perfect composure. She stood in her small kitchen for a long time after that, breathing steadily. She was not angry exactly. She was tired. Tired of the particular kind of ownership that men tried to wrap in concern. Tired of the idea that her reputation was a thing that could be threatened by being seen walking with a good man in broad daylight. Tired of the way they turned her independence into a problem they were offering to solve. She was awake for a long time that night. Not with agitation, but with that particular kind of wakefulness that comes when something inside you is shifting, and you are aware of it moving. The trouble with Duval escalated in September, as things tended to in the heat-shortened days of early autumn when tempers ran short and the stakes were highest. Duval was a big rancher, the biggest in the county, and he had the kind of money that made him believe the rules that applied to smaller men did not apply to him. He had been running his cattle through the eastern corridor since before half the homesteaders there had arrived, and he did not see why their presence should change his routes. What changed things was when his foreman, a hard-faced man named Crowell, cut the fencing of a farmer named Hector Ray's one night and drove 100 head through his winter wheat field. Ray's was a Mexican-American man who had bought his land legally and worked it harder than anyone on the corridor. He had a wife and 2 young children and had put everything he had into that wheat crop. One night's damage set him back by something close to ruin. Elijah was on the scene by dawn the next morning, having heard from a neighboring farmer who had seen the lights and heard the cattle. He walked the damage carefully, measured it, sketched a diagram of the destroyed acreage in his record book, and spoke to Ray's with the particular care of a man who understood what this kind of loss felt like. "I will bring this to the sheriff," he told Ray's. "And I will write to the territorial land office. Duval does not have any legal right to this passage, and he knows it. He has been betting that no one will push back hard enough." Ray's was a composed man, but his hands were shaking. His wife stood in the doorway of their farmhouse with a child on her hip and eyes that had that hollowed look of someone watching their work dismantled. "He has money for lawyers," Ray's said. "He does," Elijah agreed. "But he does not have documentation of this kind, and we do. Evidence is a harder thing to argue against than money, when it gets in front of the right people." Opal heard about the Ray's damage the same day, because it traveled through the whole of Cassidy Creek by noon, as bad news always did. She went to the mercantile and bought a sack of flour and dried beans and salt pork, and took them out to the Ray's farm herself that afternoon without waiting to be asked or organized. Elena Ray's, who was a proud woman and not easily given to accepting charity, stood in her doorway with that careful dignity that said she did not want to need this. "It is not charity," Opal said before Elena could speak. "My father had a saying. He said that neighbors sharing what they have is the only economy that actually works. I am your neighbor." Elena looked at her for a long moment and then stepped back to let her in. Elijah arrived at the Ray's farm the following day with a work party of 4 other corridor farmers who had volunteered their labor, and they spent 3 days repairing the fencing and salvaging what could be salvaged of the wheat crop. When Opal brought out lunch to the workers on the second day, she found Elijah on his knees in the field, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, working as hard as any of the farmers, and she stood watching him for a moment without meaning to. He looked up and saw her, and there was nothing complicated in that look. Just recognition and pleasure, the way you might look at someone whose presence makes the day better without any calculation attached to it. She distributed food and stayed to help. And in the late afternoon, when the light went amber and long across the damaged field, and most of the workers had headed home, she and Elijah walked the perimeter of the repaired fencing together, checking the work. And it was entirely natural and entirely necessary, and she was very aware of how close they were walking. "You did not have to bring the food," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I did it." He laughed, and she realized she had been wanting to hear that sound, specifically that sound, his laugh, which was quiet and genuine, the kind that came from somewhere real. "Can I ask you something honest?" she said. "You generally seem to. Why did you come to Cassidy Creek, specifically? There are 100 towns in Texas." He was quiet for a stride or two. "I was in Laredo when I heard a man talking about this corridor problem. He said there was a sheriff who needed a good hand and was willing to pay for honest work. The word honest was the thing, not profitable or exciting. Honest." He paused. "That is what I was looking for. Just honest work. Honest work in a place where I did not already owe anybody anything and nobody owed me anything. A clean start." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her, and she said what she was thinking because that had always been her way. "You are a good man, Elijah Rhodes." He looked slightly surprised, as if good man were a category he was not certain he belonged in and was not sure he should accept. "I try to be," he said. "You succeed more than you know," she said. They stood in the last of the afternoon light, with the mountains going purple behind them, and the repaired fencing running neat and straight across the field. And neither of them moved for a moment, and neither of them needed to. And something between them that had been building quietly for weeks became unmistakably present in that stillness. She walked home that evening with the particular fullness in her chest that she had not experienced before, and could not quite name, except that it felt like the beginning of something large and irreversible. The showdown with Duval did not happen in any single dramatic moment, but rather in the way real confrontations tend to happen, through the slow accumulation of documented evidence, and the moment when that evidence reached someone with the authority to act on it. Elijah sent his records to the Territorial Land Office in Austin, and the response, when it came, was more substantial than he had hoped. A federal land commissioner arrived in Cassidy Creek in October, a dry, precise man named Alderholt, who read through Elijah's documentation with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what it meant legally. Duval rode into town the day the commissioner arrived, which was either impressive intelligence or bad timing, and he arrived with 4 of his men and his lawyer, a slick figure from San Antonio named Pickett, and the atmosphere in the sheriff's office was considerably heavier than usual. Opal was not in that meeting, but she was in the street outside it, because 3 of the corridor farmers had come to town for it, and their anxiety was a tangible thing, and she thought they should know someone was standing with them. She brought coffee from the diner and stood with Hector Reyes and the other farmers in the morning cold and waited. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When Elijah came out, he looked tired in the way you look tired after something difficult has gone right rather than wrong. He came directly to where the farmers were standing. "He has been ordered to establish and use a designated corridor that does not pass through private agricultural land," he said. "It will be formalized within 60 days, and the damage to the Reyes property is recognized in the commissioner's report, which means Reyes has grounds for a legal claim against Duval for restitution." There was a moment of complete silence among the farmers. Hector Reyes put his hand on Elijah's shoulder and said something in Spanish that Opal did not catch, but that made Elijah put his own hand briefly over Reyes's and nod. She caught Elijah's eye over the small crowd, and she smiled at him. A real smile, the full one she did not give out for politeness, and he looked at her with that slightly undone expression of a man who has just been reached by something and is not entirely sure what to do with the feeling. Duval, riding out of town with considerably less authority than he had arrived with, stopped his horse near the group on the street. He was a big man with a hard red face and the look of someone who had not heard the word no enough times in his life. "You cost me considerable money and trouble," he said, looking at Elijah. "You cost these men their crops and their time," Elijah said. He said it without heat, just as a fact, and that simple flatness was somehow more definitive than anger would have been. Duval looked at the farmers, then at Opal, and then back at Elijah with something calculating in his expression. "You are making enemies," he said. "I am making things right," Elijah said. "I have found those tend to go together." Duval rode away, and the street let out a collective breath, and someone was laughing and Hector Reyes was shaking hands with everyone, and the widow Marlowe, who had somehow materialized from nowhere as old women in small towns often do, was already saying it called for a celebration. That evening, there was something close to a gathering at the widow Marlowe's house, informal and warm, the kind of thing that springs up naturally when a community has survived something together. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a jug of something that was not exactly labeled. The farmers and their families came, and there was food and noise, and the kind of generosity that does not call itself generous, because it is simply what people do. Elijah found Opal standing on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mountains go dark against a sky that was turning extravagant colors, pinks and golds, and a particular shade of violet that only happened in the hill country at this time of year. "You should be inside being congratulated," she said. "I prefer it out here," he said. He stood beside her at the porch railing, and they were quiet for a time with the music coming from inside. "You knew this might not work," she said. "That commissioner might not have cared." "I knew," he said. "It would have been easier to stay out of it. You are not from here. You had no stake in it." "I had a stake," he said. "I was here. That makes it mine." She looked at him sideways in the fading light. "Most people do not see it that way. Most people save their energy for things that benefit them directly," he said. "That is a reasonable way to live. I have just never been able to manage it." The fiddle inside started something slower, and the voices softened into conversation. The evening cooled around them, and neither of them moved away from the railing, and they were standing close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she was very aware of the almost. "Opal," he said, and there was something different in the way he said it, a slight weight on the word that had not been there before. "Yes." He turned to face her, and in the near dark she could see that careful, honest attention he always gave to things he was about to say, not performing, not rehearsing, just finding the right words with the same precision he brought to everything else. "I am not going to pretend I have not been thinking about this for a while," he said. "And I am not going to dress it up in something it is not. I would like to spend more time with you, not as neighbors, not as people who happen to cross paths. I mean deliberately. I would like to know you better, and I would like you to know me, and I am aware that you are a woman who has thought carefully about what you do and do not want, and I am not asking you to want what you do not want. I am just telling you honestly what I would like." She breathed in slowly. "You are telling me what you want," she said, "without telling me what I ought to want. Yes, without listing your property or your prospects." "I do not have much property," he said. "My prospects are reasonable but not impressive." She laughed, and he smiled, and the evening was warm despite the cool in the air, and she said, "Then yes, Elijah, I would like that too." He did not do anything dramatic. He did not sweep her off her feet or make a grand gesture. He offered her his hand, and she took it, and they stood on the widow Marlowe's back porch listening to the fiddle with their hands linked, and the mountains going dark, and it was one of the finest moments she had ever stood inside. The courtship of Opal Hayes and Elijah Rhodes was, like the people in it, both simple and profound. They rode together on Sunday mornings along the creek bed, through stands of cottonwood gone gold in the autumn light, talking with the ease of two people discovering that they agree on more than they expected and disagree with interest on the things they do not. He read her book he had been carrying in his saddlebag, a battered copy of Emerson's Essays, and she lent him her father's copy of A History of the Republic of Texas, which he read, and returned with 3 pages of genuine questions written on a scrap of paper tucked inside. She brought him supper twice a week at the livery, not because he could not feed himself, but because the arrangement pleased them both. And they would sit on the stacked hay bales with their plates and talk until the stars were well out. And then she would walk home in the dark, and he would stand in the livery door and watch until she turned the corner, which she pretended not to notice. He went to the school one afternoon to drop off a set of tools he had repaired for the schoolhouse door, and she saw him through the window crouching down to look at something one of the smaller children was showing him with the unself-conscious patience he gave to everything, and she had to look away and breathe for a moment before she could continue the lesson. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Towns like Cassidy Creek were not in the habit of missing things. The reactions were varied. The widow Marlowe was openly delighted and had apparently been engineering it since approximately the day Elijah arrived, which Opal suspected and chose not to investigate too deeply. Most of the farming families on the corridor were warmly approving, partly because they liked Elijah and partly because they liked Opal, and they thought it was a fine thing. Some of the more comfortable residents, the men with property and the women who moved in their circles, were more cautious, with the particular cautiousness of people who had decided how things ought to be arranged and found reality uncooperative. Harlan Beckett had the grace to say nothing further to Opal about it, though his expression when he saw her in the street told its own story. She met his eye without difficulty and greeted him pleasantly, and he nodded with the dignity of a man accepting a loss he has not fully processed. There was one evening in late October that she would remember clearly for the rest of her life. They had ridden out to the ridge east of the gantry farm at sunset to look at a view Elijah had found on one of his corridor rides, a stretch of landscape that opened up unexpectedly into a vista of the mountains and the valley below, sweeping and ancient and so beautiful it made conversation seem briefly beside the point. They tied the horses and sat on a flat boulder and watched the light change. She was sitting close enough to him that when he turned toward her their faces were near, and she was not surprised by it and not nervous about it in the way she had expected she might be nervous. She was simply very present. "My father would have liked you," she said. "Tell me about him." And she did. She talked about Gerald Hayes with the full warmth of the love she had carried for him through 3 years of grief. The man who had taught school in 4 different territories because he believed in it, who had read to her every night until she was old enough to read to him, who had looked at the world's injustices with anger and then rolled up his sleeves. Elijah listened with the particular quality of attention he always gave, taking in her words as if each one mattered, and when she finished there was a silence that was not empty but full. "He taught you to be honest," Elijah said. "He taught me that comfort was not the same as goodness," she said. "That safety was not the same as love. That accepting a smaller life so that someone else could feel important was not a virtue even when people called it one." He looked at her for a long moment. "He was right," he said. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the stone, and he turned his hand to hold hers, and they sat like that as the last of the sun went below the mountains and the first stars appeared, and the evening was completely still except for the wind moving through the grass below them. She kissed him first, because she was Opal Hayes, and she did not wait for things she had already decided she wanted. She turned and kissed him with the same directness she brought to everything, and he received it with a stillness that immediately became complete attention, his free hand coming up to the side of her face with a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than anything forceful would have been. They rode back to town in the warm darkness, and she could feel the change in the world, or not the world in herself, in the way the air felt, and the way the stars looked, and the way she was not afraid of any of it. November came in cold and brilliant, and with it came the particular acceleration that comes when two people have already decided on each other and are simply filling in the details. They were seen everywhere together, and they stopped pretending otherwise, which was a relief to both of them and to everyone who had been politely not noticing. He told her about his family, A mother who had died when he was 12 and a father who had been a good man broken by grief into a quieter version of himself. And two brothers, one of whom was farming in Colorado and one of whom he had lost track of years ago. He told her about the Ranger years without glamorizing them, the parts that had been important and the parts that had worn something out of him. The moment he had looked at the homesteader with the 3 children and known that the law he was being asked to enforce was not justice. She told him about her years before Texas, moving from place to place with her father, the gifts that gave you, knowing how to arrive somewhere new and make yourself useful before you made yourself comfortable, the way it taught you that home was not a building but a quality of being. "Is that why you stayed here?" he asked. "After your father died, you could have gone back east." "I had no east to go back to," she said, "and besides," she looked at the walls of her small house, the books on the shelves, the garden out the window. "I built this. I'm not going to leave it because it is hard." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already understood about her. "What do you want?" he asked. It was a straightforward question, and he asked it without qualification, meaning everything, meaning the whole of her life and what she wanted from it. "I want my work," she said. "I want to keep teaching. I want this house. I want the garden and the Widow Marlowe's mare and the books." She paused. "I want not to be anyone's furniture." "You could never be furniture," he said, with a certainty that was completely without flattery. "Some men would like to try." "I know," he said. "I am not those men." "I know," she said softly. "That is the thing." The proposal happened on a morning in mid-November, which was not the most romantic month but was the month it happened, and the circumstances were not orchestrated, which was appropriate. They had been repairing the fence on the eastern edge of her property, which ran along the road and had been battered by an early winter storm. He was doing most of the heavy work, and she was holding the wire and handing him tools, and they were working with the comfortable efficiency of people who know how to move together in a shared task. It was cold and clear, the sky that hard, brilliant blue it gets when the temperature drops, and she was wearing her heaviest coat and her breath was making clouds in the air. He stopped working. She looked at him, and he had that expression she had come to know, the expression he wore when he was finding the right words for something important. "Opal," he said. "Yes. I have been thinking about how to say this, and I have decided there is no clever way to do it, so I am going to say it plainly." She set down the wire and turned to face him fully, her heart doing something large and unhurried in her chest. "I am not a rich man," he said. "I have $35 a month and a good horse and some books, and I know how to work hard and I know how to be honest, and those are the main things I have to offer. I am not going to tell you that I will provide you with every comfort because I do not know that I can, and I would not say something I cannot stand behind." He paused and looked at her with everything open. "What I can tell you is that I will always be straight with you. I will never make you smaller to make myself larger. I will always—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. He blinked. "You were not finished," he said. "I know," she said, "but I had heard enough." He stared at her for one suspended moment, and then something in his face did what she had been wanting to see for months. It broke open into an expression of pure, uncalculated joy, the way a man looks when something he had hoped for but not quite believed in turns out to be real. She laughed at his expression, and he laughed at her laughing, and then they were both laughing in the cold morning air with the fence half mended between them. And then he stepped over the bottom wire, and she closed the distance the rest of the way, and he held her with both arms, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed him in, wood smoke and cold air and honest work, and felt more at home than she had felt since her father died. "Yes," she said again against his coat, just to say it again, just to feel the word in her mouth. "I was going to say more things," he said, his voice slightly unsteady in the best way. "There were more things I wanted to say." "Say them later," she said. He held her closer, and the cold morning was brilliant around them, and the fence stayed half mended for another 2 hours, and neither of them cared in the slightest. They were married in December on a Saturday in the small church at the south end of town. The Widow Marlowe cried. Hector Reyes and his wife Alina were there, and the corridor farmers were there, and the sheriff was there, and most of the town was there because Cassidy Creek took its wedding seriously. Opal wore a dress she had made herself from deep blue wool, the best fabric available at the dry goods store, which she had bought from Harlan Beckett with great composure and the pleasant civility of a woman who bears no grudges. She wore her hair up with 2 pins that had belonged to her mother, small turquoise stones that caught the light when she moved. When she came down the center of that little church and saw Elijah standing at the front of it, she thought that the whole of her careful, obstinate, refusing life had been building toward this man, who did not need her to be anything other than exactly what she was. He watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man seeing something he cannot quite believe is real, and when she reached him he took her hand and she could feel that he was steadying himself, this steady man, and that moved her more than anything else could have. The minister spoke the words. They said them back. And when it was done and they walked out into the brilliant, cold December morning into the cheering of their community, Elijah stopped on the church steps and looked at her and said, "I had more to say by the fence that morning. Do you want to hear it now?" She stopped too, there on the church steps with everyone around them. "Yes," she said. "Now I want to hear all of it." He took her hands in both of his and he said, "I was going to say that I will never ask you to be less than you are. I was going to say that your work matters, the teaching and the caring for people and the willingness to say difficult true things, and I do not want to be a reason for any of it to diminish. I was going to say that I am not asking you to fold yourself into my life. I am asking if we can make something new together that belongs to us both equally." He paused. That was what I was going to say. The whole church porch was very quiet for a moment because people had heard that. Opal Hayes, who had refused 4 men who offered her comfort, who had been called difficult and foolish and impractical, whose father had taught her that there was a difference between a comfortable life and a real one, squeezed both of Elijah Rhodes's hands and said, "That is everything I wanted to hear." Then the widow Marlowe started crying again, and Hector Reyes started clapping, and the whole thing became noise and celebration and warmth. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of season that tests a new arrangement, cold and demanding and close-quartered, and it turned out to be good for them in the way that genuine things are improved by pressure. They moved into Opal's house, which was slightly larger than the room above the livery, and they made it work with the particular ingenuity of people who are inventive by necessity and nature. He built 2 more bookshelves to accommodate the combined volume of their reading material. She organized the small bedroom with the practicality of a woman who had been managing a space alone for 3 years and understood every inch of it. They settled into the rhythms of a shared life, the negotiation of space and habit, the discovery of which differences between them were fascinating and which required genuine patience. They found that they were, in most things, naturally suited. They were both early risers. They were both comfortable with silence, which was perhaps the greatest gift, the ability to be in a room together without either of them feeling the need to fill it. They disagreed sometimes, honest and occasionally heated disagreements, about how to handle a situation or what a particular decision should be. And those disagreements were good too, because neither of them shut down or capitulated for the sake of peace. They argued toward something, usually toward a third answer that was better than either of their starting positions. He came to school once a week to give the older children a lesson in practical mathematics using real problems, surveying and cost accounting, and the kind of calculations that came from actual ranching and farming. And she watched the children respond to him with the trust they gave to people who did not condescend to them. And she felt that particular pride of someone watching a person they love be good at something. She started accompanying him on some of the corridor rides in the spring, not officially but practically, because she knew the farming families well, and her presence made conversations easier in the cases where the men were wary and the women had more information. Elijah recognized this without any fuss and included her without ceremony, and the two of them together were more effective than either alone, which they both understood and appreciated. The Ray's family's restitution claim came through in April, a ruling in their favor that, while not a large sum, represented the principle of the thing, the recognition that they had rights and those rights had been violated, and there was consequence for that. Elena Reyes came to the school to tell Opal the news, and they embraced on the schoolhouse steps like the friends they had become. And that evening Opal told Elijah, and watched his face do that quiet, satisfied thing it did when justice was served without spectacle. The spring also brought something Opal had begun to suspect in February, and had confirmed by March. And she waited until a Sunday morning when they were at the breakfast table with coffee, and she said it the way she said most things, directly. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table. "Opal," he said, and there was so much in just her name, the way he said it, so much wonder and so much serious tenderness, that her eyes went warm. "I am pleased about it," she said. He stopped and started again. Yes, I am very pleased." He shook his head slightly as if adjusting to the magnitude of it. "Are you well? Do you need anything? What do you need?" "Right now I need you not to treat me as if I am made of glass," she said. "I am healthy and capable, and this is a natural thing." "Yes," he said immediately. "Yes, of course. But your face just now," she said and smiled. "Keep that." "What?" "That expression," she said. "The one you had for a moment when I told you. Keep that." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I will try," he said. The pregnancy was, in the manner of most pregnancies, both ordinary and extraordinary at once. She continued teaching until June, when the summer heat and the growing discomfort made it impractical, and she continued most of her other work with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent years making herself useful, and did not intend to stop simply because her circumstances had changed. Elijah was attentive in the way she had asked, which was to say without hovering, present and watchful and quietly adjusting things around her, without making a production of it. He took over the heavier garden work as summer progressed, and she directed him from the shade of the porch, which he accepted with good nature, and she permitted with the awareness that sometimes accepting help gracefully was its own kind of strength. The widow Marlowe, who had apparently been waiting for this development with even more patience than she had shown during the courtship, was at the house 3 afternoons a week, and she and Opal made preparations together in the warm kitchen, the widow's 70-year store of practical knowledge about births and infants flowing out in the comfortable setting of afternoon conversation. In mid-September, with the heat breaking and the first hint of autumn coming off the mountains, Opal Hayes Rhodes gave birth to a boy. He arrived in the early morning hours with the assistance of the widow Marlowe and a capable midwife named Mrs. Greer, and Elijah was in the kitchen the entire time doing everything the midwife told him, and some things she did not tell him. And when the sound of the baby's first cry cut through the still house, he sat down abruptly on the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands. When they brought him in to see them, Opal was propped up against the pillows with the child in her arms, exhausted and completely alive, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked up when Elijah came in, and there was so much in her face that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment. "Come and meet him," she said. He crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at the baby with the same attention he gave to everything he found important, and the baby was red and crumpled, and absolutely the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. "He has your mouth," Opal said. "He has your determination," Elijah said, which made her laugh, which the baby seemed to find mildly alarming. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had talked about names but had not decided. He looked at the baby for a long moment. "Gerald," he said, "if you agree." She went very still for a moment. Gerald Hayes, her father, the best man she had known until she met this one. "Yes," she said. "Gerald." She looked down at the baby. "Gerald Rhodes." Elijah put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the baby between them, and the morning came in through the window, and the world they had made together held all three of them without apology. The years that followed were full years. Gerald Rhodes grew from the crumpled mourning presence into a red-headed boy of tremendous energy and strong opinions who had his mother's green eyes and his father's stillness when something genuinely interested him. He went to the school his grandfather had built, taught by his mother, which was an arrangement that produced some conflict and more laughter. Elijah's work evolved with the town. As Cassidy Creek grew, the need for the kind of steady, trustworthy presence he offered grew with it. He worked with the sheriff for another 3 years, and then, when Whitfield retired in 1883, the town voted on a new sheriff and Elijah's name came up before anyone else's. He stood in front of the assembled town in the meeting hall and said he was willing to serve on the condition that his work would be directed by what was actually right and not by who had the most money or the most years in the county. And there was a moment of silence, and then Hector Reyes said, "We know that about you, Elijah. That is why we are asking," and the vote was not close. He wore the badge with the same quiet authority he had brought to everything else, and Cassidy Creek under his watch was not a lawless place, but neither was it an unjust one, which is a much harder thing to achieve. He took disputes seriously and examined them fully before deciding. He treated the Mexican-American families and the newer arriving families with the same respect he gave to the oldest landholders, which caused some friction with those who believed seniority was the same as superiority, and he absorbed that friction without changing his approach. Opal continued teaching through all of it, adding a second schoolroom when the town's children outgrew the original, training a younger teacher to handle the primary grades while she took the older children, and gave them the kind of instruction that her father had given her. Not just facts and figures, but how to think, how to question, how to consider a thing from more than one side. Their house grew with them, Elijah adding a room in 1882 and a porch in 1883, and the garden grew too, extended and reorganized and producing enough that Opal regularly sent baskets to the families on the corridor who were in harder seasons. In the spring of 1884, Gerald Rhodes was given a brother. They named him Samuel, after Elijah's father, and he arrived in the world with considerably less drama than Gerald had, a calm infant from the first who slept through things that would have had his brother in uproar. Where Gerald was loud and immediate and physical, Samuel was watchful and patient, and by the time he could walk he had his father's way of standing and simply observing the world with attention that looked like stillness, but was actually full of activity. Gerald was enormously opinionated about his brother from the beginning, alternating between fierce protectiveness and exasperated authority in the way of eldest children everywhere. "He is mine," Gerald announced to his parents at 4 years old, regarding the infant Samuel with an expression of proprietary satisfaction. "He is his own," Opal said. "As are you." Gerald considered this. "He is also mine," he said firmly, which was the kind of argument she recognized, and which made Elijah hide a smile behind his coffee cup. The widow Marlowe lived to see both boys and declared Samuel the more sensible one, which Gerald resented for the better part of a year. She passed in the winter of 1886, in her own bed, with Opal sitting with her at the end, and she went with the quiet completion of someone who has done what they came to do. Opal grieved her with the full depth of the debt she owed her, and planted a rose bush by the window of the schoolhouse, where the widow had always been able to see it from her porch. And that felt like the right kind of memorial for a woman who had always preferred the real over the ceremonial. Elijah rode to the Reyes farm on the morning they heard, because Hector Reyes had been fond of the old woman, and the two men spent an hour sitting on the porch talking about her with the affectionate honesty you can only offer someone after they are gone. Elena Reyes fed them lunch, and their 3 children, now old enough to be curious about everything, crowded around the adults and asked questions, and it was a good afternoon in the middle of a sad one. In 1887, Opal learned she was expecting again. She was 32 by then, and the pregnancy was harder than the others had been, and she did not pretend otherwise. She rested when she needed to rest and accepted help when she needed it, which was progress of a kind, the kind that only comes when you have been loved well enough and long enough to trust that accepting care is not the same as giving up your strength. Elijah was more attentive this time, with the better understanding of what attentiveness from him looked like. Not fussing, not reducing, but present. He came home earlier from the office. He sent Gerald and Samuel to help at the Ray's farm on weekends so the house was quieter. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings when she was tired, and they would read, side by side, not talking, just in the same air. And she thought that this was the thing people meant when they used the word sanctuary. The third child was a girl. She arrived in late November, early and impatient, which was a quality Opal recognized. The midwife said she was small but sound, and she was, with her father's dark hair and eyes that would settle eventually to the particular green of her mother's. "Clara," Opal said, when they had her swaddled in calm. Elijah, who had been even quieter and more charged this pregnancy because of how difficult the last weeks had been, held his daughter with the tremendous careful gentleness he had always had with small living things, horses and children and the truth, and looked at Opal with everything he felt running openly in his face. "Clara," he said. "Yes." Gerald, who was 7, was mildly scandalized that his new sibling was a girl. Samuel, 5, was simply interested. Within a week, Gerald had reversed entirely and was the most proprietorial older brother imaginable, which was entirely predictable to anyone who knew him. Clara Rhodes grew up as the youngest child of a woman who had spent her best years proving that a person could build a meaningful life on their own terms, and a man who had given up a career in law enforcement for justice and found both in the end. And the combination of those inheritances made her formidable in a way that would eventually make Cassidy Creek very interesting in about 20 years. But that is a longer story. What mattered in the daily texture of those years was this. The house on the east side of Cassidy Creek was a house where people were welcome and fed, where the bookshelves were always full and the garden was always tended, where there was a cast iron stove that smelled like cinnamon on Sunday mornings, and a porch that caught the sunset light, and a corral where Elijah still worked with horses that other people had given up on. It was a house where the children were taught that honesty was not a strategy but a practice. That work was not just how you earned money, but how you located yourself in the world. That the people around you with less advantage were not unfortunate examples of what you should be grateful not to be, but your community, and community was what you made it. It was a house where Opal Hayes Rhodes, who had been called difficult and foolish and impractical, taught school for 30 years, and was known eventually as the finest teacher that section of Texas ever produced. Where Elijah Rhodes served as sheriff until 1891, and then as a judge, which was something he took to with the same uncomplicated moral clarity he had always had, and where he was regarded by the people of Cassidy Creek, and eventually the wider county, as a man whose word was the most reliable thing available to any of them. They argued over those years with the same honesty they had always brought to each other. They weathered bad seasons and good ones, the death of people they loved and the births of people they would love, the political upheavals of a territory becoming a state, the slow changes in the land and the town and the people. They were not a romantic story that ended at the altar. They were a love story that continued working, that renewed itself in the daily choice to be honest rather than easy, present rather than comfortable, real rather than merely content. On a Thursday evening in November of 1889, 10 years almost exactly from the month Elijah had ridden into Cassidy Creek on his dusty roan horse, Opal found him on the back porch after supper, sitting in the chair he had made the summer after Gerald was born, looking at the mountains the way he sometimes did at the end of a day that had been long and requiring. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside him, and the children were inside doing the battles of homework and bedtime that she could hear in the comfortable background noise of a full house. And the sky over the mountains was doing what it did at this time of year, going through colors you could not quite describe to someone who had not seen them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. In the way she had come to understand was not avoidance but real consideration. "That morning by the fence," he said, "when I was trying to find the right words," she smiled, "and I interrupted you. You did. You said the rest of it later on the church steps." "I know." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I have been thinking about whether I said everything I meant to say, whether there were things I left out." She looked at him sideways in the cooling evening. "Did you leave something out?" He turned to look at her, and there was that same openness in his face that had been there from almost the beginning, that quality of looking directly at things without protecting himself from what he might see or what she might see in return. "I meant to say," he said, "that I was not offering you a comfortable life because I was not sure I could provide one, and I would not say something I could not stand behind. But I meant to say also that whatever I had, whatever I could make, I wanted to make it with you. Not alongside you, with you, as an equal part of it, and that whatever it turned out to be, hard or easy or somewhere in between, I wanted it to be honest. The life itself, honest all the way through." She set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and turned in her chair to face him fully. "Elijah Rhodes," she said, "yes, that was the most right thing anyone has ever said to me." He reached out and took her hand the way he had taken it 1,000 times in 10 years, with the assurance of someone who knows that the hand offered is given freely and always freely, never from obligation, never from fear, and that made the taking of it something that never diminished. The mountains went dark. The stars came out over the Davis Range with the particular abundance of that sky. So many and so close it always felt slightly unbelievable, no matter how many times you watched them. Inside the house, Gerald was arguing about mathematics and Samuel was reading, and Clara was doing what she would always do, watching and thinking and forming opinions she would not announce until she was entirely ready. Opal Hayes Rhodes sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and the full weight of her life around her, not the comfortable life she had been offered and refused, but the honest one, built piece by piece from the kind of love that does not require you to become smaller to fit inside it. She was exactly where she had chosen to be. She was exactly who she had always been, and the man beside her had never asked her to be anything else. The night settled around them, and the whole of Cassidy Creek was quiet under a sky full of impossible stars, and everything between them was resolved and real and deeply, permanently good.